Welcome back to your Science Saturday. And I know it's Wednesday. Just play along. Some of you will see this on a Saturday and think, oh, Science Saturday sounds good. Anyway, today we are talking about the implications for Femoroacetabular Impingement syndrome, hip impingement in goalies, as it relates to on-ice movements. We're going to dive into the science of that.
Science Saturday.
Today I am going to walk you through this article because I don't think it means what you think it means.
I don't think it means what you think it means.
And don't worry, because I made the exact same mistake that a lot of you made a few years ago. It was very embarrassing. I felt the shame.
You feel shame, you know.
So let's walk through this article step by step. So the article is by Whiteside et al., which is just a way to say and everybody else, because a lot of people contribute to articles. It was out of the University of Michigan, published in 2015. So these things don't get published quickly, so it means that the research took place at least somewhere in 2014, if not earlier than that. So a key thing right here to keep in mind, this is pre-RVH. They used 14 male sort of college age players. They were either college, so NCAA Division I, or pro players. So fairly small sample size, but that's what they used. And they looked at three key movements of goaltending, or what they highlighted as three key movements of goaltending. They referred to it as a long rebound sequence. So basically they looked at, we'll go over exactly what that was in a second, but basically they looked at the T-push, the butterfly, and then a recovery. So this is the sequence. So the goalie would start from their stance in the crease, and they would explode forward in a T-push to the top of their crease. So they would be decelerating by sort of shaving that blade across the surface of the ice. Then they would do a butterfly, and then they would do a butterfly recovery. So they would pivot, recover back to their skates, back to the post. So what exactly were they measuring? They measured these four areas: peak femoral shock, peak, gotta get the order right, max flexion, so range of motion flexion, max adduction, range of motion, max internal rotation, range of motion. Note, torque was not mentioned there. So a range of motion is just how much is that joint moving. A torque is a measure of how much force is on that joint, how much load is on that joint. So there's a difference between, turning my wrist like this and, turning my wrist against a resistance through that same range of motion. So the big key point that where I think a lot of people have sort of missed, and I missed it too. I referenced this study, probably maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I hadn't gone back to reread it. In my head, it was like, oh yeah, the force. No, it's not the force. It's just the range of motion. So we can't make a leap, and you might think, well, common sense, but scientifically, we can't make the leap between, because there's the most range of motion, that's the most harmful, or that's the most force, or whatever. It's just, that puts us in the greatest range of motion. Now let's look at what they all found. So there were a lot of kind of nitty-gritty findings, and they look at each, movement and compared to internal to external, and they really break it down. It's a fantastic article. So if you want to sort of get into the minutia of it, definitely go and check out the article. It's from the American Journal of Sport Medicine, published in 2015, Whiteside et al. But here's sort of the big practical take-homes. Femoral shock was the greatest in the butterfly. But also what they found is it wasn't really that much. It was at about 8% of body weight, which I think they said is actually a little bit less for runners and that kind of thing. So they hypothesized that maybe because the goalie lands on the pads, on the knee stack, it helps cushion it a little bit, but they were expecting a bigger effect size. Now, is that effect size relevant to injury? You can't say that. They're just looking, that's why this is a good science study. They're not trying to prove a point. They're just collecting the data and saying, here's what the data suggests, or here's how we've interpreted the data. Hip internal rotation was the greatest in the T-push deceleration. And this again was a little bit surprising because they thought that it was probably going to be in the butterfly. It makes sense that it isn't when you think about it from a hockey perspective. When I just drop into my butterfly, there's no friction. There's nothing to anchor my feet to hold them wide. When I'm decelerating from a T-push, and they were very specific, that it's when the blade is shaving across the ice. So when I have my skate, turned inward and I'm sliding on the ice and almost, sort of snapping my hips around over top of that. That sort of exceeded my normal passive hip internal rotation range of motion, or in the study, it exceeded theirs. And that makes sense because the blade is anchored. There's some friction there that then I can torque over top of to get that extra range of motion. The RVH is a similar type of thing. I can anchor into the post and then, torque my hips around. So it would be really cool if somebody would redo a study like this, but add in the RVH, because I bet you that they'd get some really interesting data there. But this is what they found. So it wasn't sort of the act of the T-push, it was the deceleration of the T-push. All three movements, this is sort of their conclusion, that all three of these movement patterns could contribute to FAI, or could contribute to inducing FAI. So it's kind of like we always talk about. Somebody had asked me a question about it, said, I know how you feel about the butterfly. I don't feel anything about the butterfly. I actually really like the butterfly when I can make save using it. The take-home message is, being a goalie isn't good for your hips. This isn't a hip health intervention. Just like being a baseball pitcher isn't good for your shoulder and your elbow. Running a marathon for a lot of people isn't good for their hips, knees, and ankles. But we love it. That's what sport is. Playing football and smashing into each other. That's not good for our bodies, but it's good for our brain, and we love it. And so, that's why we do it. But this is saying basically being a goalie, not good for your hips. The stuff you do with your hips not meant to do. So, and then deceleration in skating, so decelerating in the T-push and butterfly were the two motions that had the most hip internal rotation. So they really talked to what I thought was interesting, or an interesting conclusion or suggestion they made was that, that deceleration from the stance where your blade is sort of shaving across the ice, and maybe your pelvis is rotating on top of that, taking you into hip internal rotation. It could explain part of the reason why too, because a lot of skaters get FAI as well. It isn't just a goalie thing. A lot of skaters get it too, and they don't do the butterfly, obviously. So,
what a situation there for Manson.
They're saying, well, this maybe suggests why it's a common feature in both skaters and goalies. They even talked about golfers. If you think of that lead leg when you golf, that's a planted femur, so there's a friction there, and then rotating the pelvis on the femur into extreme hip internal rotation, and they also get trouble with hip impingement. So I thought that was a really neat conclusion, because we do always sort of look at the butterfly and blame the butterfly for all these things, but from a stance position, that sort of fixed femur with pelvis on femur rotation, they're saying could be one of the primary contributors to FAI. FAI is, or Femoroacetabular Impingement Syndrome, isn't this caused it. It's a cumulative trauma injury, so it's over time. We can basically build up a bony callus by putting our joints into end range motion that they're not really designed to go into, and it's part anatomy. Some of us are gifted with being biased towards having more hip internal rotation, and some of us not. So if we're not biased to that having goalie hips, it's going to cause more wear and tear, so we may develop that FAI earlier in our career. If you want to learn a whole bunch more about FAI and the science behind it and what to do, and when you might need surgery, when surgery is the answer, when surgery isn't the answer, when you need to go see the physiotherapist, because sometimes the onset is a little bit funny, and it's almost like, I tweaked my groin again, but it's not. You're not tweaking your groin. You're impingement is starting to say, hello, like red flag, something's going on here. So if you want to learn all about that, I went over tons of research, put together like a really comprehensive guide to FAI as it relates to hockey goalies. So you can check that out here. It's a long read, but it also gives you some strategies to try if you think, oh, you know, I wonder if this is a hip impingement. One of the keys too is just prepare your body to do what you're going to ask it to do on the ice. So, you know, and I'm a big believer that off-ice training can help reduce the risk of a lot of these injuries, or help reduce the magnitude of a lot of these injuries by reducing the wear and tear on the joints, by having better control and stability and efficiency of movement. So if you want to learn how you can get me to design all of your workouts and sort of help you along the way, check out the link in the description. If you haven't done the butterfly challenge yet, check that out, because it can help sort of mobilize your hips a little bit, or stretch, improve your mobility into hip internal rotation, but also give you some control. It's free, so just go to your app store and search butterfly challenge. So that's what this study looked at. This is what they found. They did not measure torque, so they did not measure force on the joint. It's just range of motion. Hey, shaving your blade across the ice as you come to a stop on a T-push put you in the most hip internal rotation. We hypothesized that going into terminal hip internal rotation can increase the risk of you developing FAI, similar to golfers, similar to what skaters go through when they're putting their hips in those positions. So I hope that helped. If you found that helpful, if you just like, oh, I love science, because science is awesome, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe. If you haven't subscribed already, do so. If you have subscribed already, hit the bell so you find out about videos before anybody else. Otherwise, I will catch you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.